The Land Rover is a very rare thing in British society because it is all things to all people. And us Brits, we're not really into that kind of thing. We're a nation of self-deprecators and of whining about the neighbours. And most modern Land Rovers and Range Rovers seem to fall very nicely into the latter of those categories. But the plucky original Land Rover is a car you cannot help but love. The story of the original Land Rover is one that's been told time and time again. But there's an awful lot of time between 1948 and 2022. So today on Twin Cam, we're going to look at how Land Rover lived and very easily could have died in the 1970s and 1980s. To do so, we have the aid of this fantastically preserved Series III Land Rover from the mid-70s. And before we get into it, you could win this very car, because I'm privileged to have been invited down to video it by Classic Giveaways, a new classic car competition site where you could win any manner of cool old cars for only a few quid. So if you're interested, I'll put a link down in the description. First things first, let's see where he came from. The car, now known as the Series I Land Rover, was launched in 1948, and regardless of its influences, successes and capabilities, it was a bit different. Because the Land Rover was designed and produced by Rover, whose bread and butter were staid and genteel luxury cars. By comparison, the Land Rover was a bit of a black sheep. It was only conceived as a response to the aftermath of the Second World War, where Britain was badly wounded, beset by a destroyed economy and continued rationing. In that period, big luxury cars didn't sell, and because Rover's old factory was destroyed by bombing, they needed a new car quickly, that would be cheap to build and easy to sell, and they totally nailed it. The Series I was in production for 10 years and changed enormously over that decade, with an all-new four-wheel drive system in 1950, a bigger engine in 53 and a 6-inch increase in wheelbase for 1954. This kind of tinkering became a standard part of Land Rover development, and in 1958 the Series II was launched. This car was the first Land Rover to be properly styled by the legendary David Batch, who was at the centre of Rover's successes with the P5, P6, Range Rover, SD1 and even the Little Metro. And from the Series II, we naturally come to the car we have here today, a Series III from the mid-70s. Visually, there isn't much to separate this from a late Series IIA, save for the plastic grille. But this is probably the most recognisable classic Land Rover, with all its features close enough to their modern positions. The barrel-like side profile, the headlamps on the wings, the 3 panes of glass at the back and the spare wheel on the door. But under the skin, it is all still very much classic old school Land Rover. So there's a separate chassis, part-time four-wheel drive and leaf springs all round. And the leaf springs are a bit of a big deal, because when this car was replaced in 1983 by the Land Rover 90 and 110, it gained the luxury of coil springs. And a lot of people hated it. They thought it wouldn't be as capable as the leaf sprung car, and so, according to a lot of people, this is the last proper Land Rover. Probably the same kind of people that today think the new Defender isn't proper because it doesn't have a separate chassis. But anyway. Bet you're wondering where I got that from. Mind out the gutter. Under the bonnet is a bit of a story in itself, because back in the Series I days, the Land Rover was just using an ordinary Rover engine, which wasn't really very suitable for four-wheel drive and off-roading. So in the late 50s, they developed an all-new engine, both in petrol and diesel forms, that would see service in Land Rovers all the way through to the mid-1980s. This one's a diesel at 2¼ litres, producing about 62 brake horsepower at this point, which is adequate. You couldn't get the famous V8 in a Land Rover until 1979. Inside, it is still very much a farm vehicle. First of all, I'm sure you can hear the echo, but it has been updated somewhat. So we have a padded dashboard, we have dials in front of the driver, which is very posh, and what is also posh is synchromesh on all 4 gears. It's positively bourgeoisie. But the thing we have to remember about the Land Rover is that it's not a car, it's built like a tool. It is everything you need and nothing that you don't. Its job is to pull things and to go anywhere. Its job is not to keep you nice and warm and cosy and comfortable. It is just a tool. And so there are no carpets. And I had to be very careful getting in just then because it's -2 degrees today and the floor is sheet ice in here. So you've just got to be careful. There's still bare aluminium on the doors. We still get the sliding windows. The latches are just like the latches you'd find on a door in your house because they're simpler. Might not be as safe or as secure, but it's simple, and that was the point of the Land Rover. But there's a lot to love about these old Land Rovers because the chassis are brilliantly capable. They will go anywhere on Earth, and the engines will outlast humanity. And though they weren't built especially well in that none of the panels fit together properly, but they were never meant to be honest, and they did have their issues at times, mainly because of British Leyland build quality, what is there in here that's not to love when it comes to a farm vehicle? Well, actually, quite a lot. You see, back in 1948, the Land Rover's only real competitor was the Willys Jeep. And due to geography, they didn't really register in the UK. For us, and quite a lot of the globe, it was Land Rover or walk. It's commonly said that for a serious portion of the planet's population, the first car they ever saw was a Land Rover. But time waits for no one, and though Rover kept updating it and kept it competitive, the Land Rover had one serious flaw, and its name was British Leyland. Back in the 1950s, the Leyland Motor Company was going about its business building buses and trucks, but they wanted to get into cars and bought Standard Triumph, one of Rover's biggest competitors, in 1961. 5 years later, in '66, Leyland gobbled up Rover too, then in 1968 merged with British Motor Holdings to form the famous British Leyland. We all know how much of a folly this was, but at the centre of it was a set of previously independent companies all still competing with each other and trying to wiggle their own way out. The 5 major players were Austin, Morris, Jaguar, Rover and Triumph, and the latter 3 all interrupted each other in one way or another, while Austin and Morris virtually imploded in the early 1970s. The result was effective nationalisation by the British government, as allowing BL to collapse would have devastated the British economy. And from this point onwards, we entered an era of massive upheaval and rationalisation, with the Land Rover as one of the very few profitable products they made. However, despite all the constant updates, the car rather began to rest on its laurels. All the way through the 50s and 60s, the Land Rover was the only choice for a truly practical and capable 4x4. In Australia, for example, they made up over 90% of the market. But as the 70s progressed, cars like the Toyota Land Cruiser grew in presence and left the Land Rover simply looking old, with weedy engines and zero refinement. BL's answer was the Range Rover, but one of those was too big and too expensive, so the Land Rover remained still while its crown was taken. The balance between ability and usability wasn't being addressed. It may have been a better off-roader, but it was a worse car. But there are 2 much bigger elephants in the room when it comes to the Land Rover's decline, both of which are intimately related to the state of BL. The first being quality and reliability. Now, we need to be careful with our definitions here, as it's very easy to look at the panel fit, for example, of this 47-year-old farm vehicle and take it as gospel. But in actual fact, no Land Rovers really left the factory with straight panels and perfect gaps. And that was on purpose. It was a utility vehicle assembled in a very particular way that would allow easy modification and repair in the future. I mean, there's a warning to disconnect the battery when welding on the slam panel. This superficial idea of quality is not what I mean. If we return to the 50s, Rover's quality control across its range was very good. They were solid, dependable, well-built and reliable cars. And in fact, early in the decade, a popular automotive magazine placed Rover's design and quality second in the world, only to Rolls-Royce. But over the next 20 years, and especially from the mid-1960s onwards, that reputation took a dramatic hit. BL as a whole was hit by a wave of strikes, crippling its production for months, and an unhappy workforce was hardly likely to produce quality cars. The new Rover SD1, launched in 1976, wound up with a world-beating reputation for falling apart. Nothing like the reputation of its predecessors. But snowballing with that was a drive to cut costs. Components were all cheapened and corners cut, leading even a basic car like the Land Rover to be assembled badly with poor quality components. An almighty fall from grace. The second problem is BL's total failure at selling cars overseas. In the UK, the Land Rover was always popular because they were easy to find and were really the only choice in the market. In North America, Rover was a very small company. The merger into BL hardly made a difference here, and with Jeep doing their thing, the Land Rover was dropped in 1974. South America and Asia saw a different scenario, where Rover had never tried to sell any cars, so they weren't a part of the picture. As a result, Rover's focus lay in Europe, Australia, New Zealand and selected African countries. We've already mentioned them, so let's focus on the Australians. In the early 70s, BL was one of Australia's big four car manufacturers. They had local assembly plants and were even launching Australia-only models of cars like the 1100 and Landcrab, as well as the wholly Australian-developed Leyland P76 saloon car. The scene was therefore ripe for Land Rovers to flourish, and as I said earlier, they did just that. But behind the scenes, things were collapsing. While the UK operations were imploding, Leyland Australia was counting heavy losses, and the quality problems were becoming just as prevalent there as they were in the UK. In fact, their poor finances led to a shortage of parts, making Land Rover parts expensive and leading to unfinished cars being parked outside factories. Just as in Britain, industrial action was crippling production itself, and with all these problems, Leyland stopped production of all its cars except the Mini and Land Rover, becoming an easy target, as the P76 was an all-new car, in production for less than 2 years. This whole perception of Leyland wounded the Land Rover, and with the other factors already mentioned, Australian buyers slowly but surely moved away from the Rover. Of course, Land Rover did survive, but not by getting better at building farm vehicles. The farmers, generally, switched over to something Japanese, and the Range Rover was the company's saviour, because that car was so cool that the Land Rover brand mentally separated itself from Rover cars in becoming a style icon and the car to be seen in through the 1990s. Enter the Discovery, the Freelander, the Evoque and the Velar. Land Rovers and Range Rovers remain immensely capable 4x4s, but they aren't agricultural vehicles anymore. However, you shouldn't demean that change. A lot of people seem to forget where the Rover name comes from. And though their name was dragged through the mud, the Rover company produced some genuinely great and segment-defining luxury cars. It just so happens that the luxury now applies to their 4x4s too, and Jaguar has rather taken on the role left by the whole of Rover cars by moving down the ladder a few rungs. And with that massive arc back round to where we started, thank you very much for watching. As I mentioned earlier, this car is being given away by Classic Giveaways. So if you fancy a big blue and white slice of British history, then do please follow the link in the description. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link for that in the description as well. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.